As Ukraine burns, Putin faces the wrath of the West and the biggest sanctions regime in history.
We're cutting off Russia's largest banks from the international financial system.
It's being called the weaponization of finance.
Nous prendrons notamment des dispositions sur les crypto-monnaies qui ne doivent pas être utilisées pour contourner les sanctions financières.
But these weapons are fighting a new kind of war. And it is one without rules.
So there's certainly a real potential for Russia to use the gold trade in order to evade Western sanctions.
They've been growing their gold stocks for the last 2 decades in this mission to try and bust sanctions and create what was called Fortress Russia.
And it is waged from the shadows.
There is a now sanctions economy emerging. States that have common cause may use the gold to create their own alternative financial system.
Billions of dollars worth of gold is being smuggled out of Africa. Its destination, the United Arab Emirates, Moscow's closest ally in the Middle East.
And I said, surely there must be somebody else involved, somebody else that's running this. And they all replied, no. The UAE want every grain and every gram of gold that we have.
Now, exclusive evidence reveals a draft plan dated 2020, well before the Ukraine war, between Abu Dhabi's royal house, a subsequently sanctioned gold tycoon, and a Belarusian oligarch.
The UAE's statecraft, as well as the brand of the UAE, is kind of open for everyone, attracting any sort of money, networks, influence, and investments from all over the world.
Driving this business plan was Africa's gold rush. Unregulated and open to corruption.
Ideologically, Moscow and Abu Dhabi have quite a lot in common, a lot more than Abu Dhabi and Washington, for example.
When Russia invaded Ukraine on February the 24th, 2022, the world looked on in horror.
Horrific human rights violations that could be equated to war crimes.
In a United Nations emergency session, 141 out of the 193 member states voted to condemn the invasion.
The resolution was supported by all member states of the European Union.
We can, will, and must stand united.
But there were some surprising abstentions.
Around half of the countries that abstained from that vote were African.
Senegal will abstain on voting from this text.
South Africa will abstain on the resolution.
Russia is now looking to Africa, as it can no longer do business with Europe. I think it's undeniable that there is a strong link.
On the day of the vote, everyone expected the UAE to condemn Putin. But its foreign minister had just announced a visit to Moscow to strengthen ties.
Today, we decided to abstain on this resolution.
It was a shock moment for most of their Western allies. The expectation was that the UAE would act as a partner for the West in the decision-making. The abstention is not a sign of neutrality. The abstention is a sign that the UAE have taken a side, which is a pro-Russian side. It was a clear symbol and signal to the Kremlin that here the UAE are a partner you can rely upon.
The Emirates' relaxed business environment has won it many friends around the world and made it very rich. And winning friends is something that the UAE is very good at. The Global Extravaganza Expo 2020 welcomed over 20 million tourists and was hailed as a major business and PR success. The UAE wants to be loved by everyone. But in the world of international politics, that's a tricky game to play for a country of fewer than 1 million citizens.
But we need to understand the UAE as a small state. They're wedged between two major powers in the region, Iran and Saudi Arabia. They're haunted by this insecurity complex, and they're trying to obviously make themselves relevant, not just within the region, but also in the global geostrategic context. They need partners inside the region and outside the region. And while they've always kind of pivoted towards the United States, traditionally, over the last decade or so, they've become a lot more assertive. And they've found that their future might actually no longer be in the West, but increasingly might be found in the East.
We could say that there are deep relations, deep contact established between not simply Mr. Putin and the leadership of the Emirates, but I would say between the Russian elite and the UAE elite since at least 2000s, if not since the 90s. And these bonds, they are quite close, and probably they distinguish the relations between Russia and UAE from Russia's contacts with other players in the Gulf.
And Russia is one of many partners that the Emiratis are integrating with because they think they could advance their interest even further rather than just putting all their eggs in the Western or American baskets.
Whilst the UAE was keen not to upset Russia, the West reacted to the invasion of Ukraine with the only weapon it could use without starting a third world war.
Wir werden das volle Paket mit massivsten Sanktionen gegen Russland auf den Weg bringen.
That means we've cut off Russia's government from Western finance.
We've frozen over $350 billion of Putin's war chest.
Less than 2 weeks after invading Ukraine, Russia became the target of nearly 3,000 new economic sanctions, making it the most sanctioned nation on earth.
Nous prendrons notamment des dispositions sur les crypto-monnaies qui ne doivent pas être utilisées pour contourner les sanctions financières décidées par l'Union européenne.
Around the world, Putin's powerful friends were sent home from their mansions, their yachts confiscated, their bank accounts frozen. But not in the UAE.
As the Iron Curtain has come down on Russian activities and Russian wealth and assets, much of that capital fled from Europe and found one destination, and that one destination is the UAE, particularly Dubai. And the UAE have welcomed them with open arms.
Especially welcoming has been Mansour bin Zayed, the Deputy Prime Minister, one of the most influential figures in the country.
He's been using his personal networks to attract these sort of high net worth individuals from Russia to come to the UAE, actually advertising, saying if you want to invest into property, if you want to put your money into banks, if you have any sort of assets, we will find ways and means to actually channel them to the UAE.
Real estate agents reported one of the biggest booms ever, as Russians snapped up apartments sight unseen, often paying in cash. The warm business relations between Russia and the UAE are matched by diplomatic and personal ties, going to the very top.
If you look at the dignitaries from Russia, from the inner circle, who've come to the UAE, either living there, putting their roots down, people like Kadyrov, for example, the Chechen leader who's kind of the envoy of the Russian regime to the Middle East. He is very, very good, intimate friend with Mohammed bin Zayed. He has a big mansion in Dubai. He's flown out his family to Dubai as the war started with Ukraine. And obviously, if you have your financial security, the security of your family in the UAE, you'll make sure the UAE will be very, very close to your heart from a Russian point of view.
The UAE prides itself on its innovation. Nowhere is that more evident than in finance for the very wealthy.
The UAE are challenging the international order and always finding loopholes of where they can create a competitive advantage for themselves as a small state. The UAE are not just very limited to putting cash into banks as the Swiss might do. There are so many other financial products that they're developing. They use precious metals. Obviously, gold has been a very important way of doing that.
Gold's unique and ancient role as an ultra-secure global currency is enjoying a renaissance that is driving up its price to unprecedented levels. These are good times to be in the gold business. This draft memo of 2020, obtained by our team, links Abu Dhabi royalty with gold trader Alan Gertz, later sanctioned in 2022. And with Russians seeking to invest their wealth, the UAE looks set to cash in on a global gold rush. In the UAE, that gold rush is to the African continent, and it is one that is rife with criminality. But gold in the Emirates has deep historical roots.
Gold was a central piece of Dubai's strategy to get beyond oil wealth. The goal was to make Dubai a global gold hub. And that made a lot of commercial sense, not just because gold is a valuable financial instrument, but because also if you're in the Middle East and you're proximate to India, etc., these are cultures that have deep traditions of gold as a form of personal and family wealth. They created an extremely business-friendly, low-tax regulatory environment that paired with their advantageous geographical location made for an extraordinary boom.
That boom has made the UAE the epitome of aspirational living and a model of Western capitalism. A highlight for any tourist in Dubai or Abu Dhabi is a visit to the famous gold souks, where huge quantities are bought and sold. 2/5 of the world's gold trade passes through here. And the origins of its merchandise are often obscure, something which for many adds to its value.
Much of the monetary gold in the world is actually what they call 4/9 gold, 99.99% pure. Once it reaches beyond about 98% purity, there's no realistic chance, even with the most sophisticated technology, of ascertaining where that gold came from.
And the difficulties in tracing the origins of gold have historically made it ideal for money laundering. One example of the way gold is used for this is a long way from the UAE, in the drugs trade.
If you are a criminal organization that's engaged in narcotics trafficking, you will be pulling in large quantities of cash. You will need somehow to launder that cash to make it look clean, or at least remove any immediate suspicion that it's tainted with criminal activity. One way to do this is to use that cash to purchase gold. Once you've actually sold the gold on to someone in the legitimate gold supply chain through a front company, through some other means, you've effectively laundered your cash.
Gold exported from African countries can be difficult to trace. Some of it travels legitimately, but significant amounts move unchecked, smuggled to other countries, including the UAE, through intermediaries. Investigative journalist Paddy Dowling tried to follow the gold trail and was shocked at what he found. He started in the West African country of Mali.
Mali has become probably the most successful gateway for gold into the Emirates. The flow of gold comes from Guinea, from the Ivory Coast, from as far back as DRC, because the system is so well set up. Everyone's involved. The police are involved. The customs are involved. The Emirates ask for the weight and the purity, and also who is buying the gold, and that's all they're interested in. So how that gold was obtained, the country it originally came from, is of no interest. When a transporter arrives with 50 kilograms of gold, hand-carried into Dubai, someone will be in a hotel room, and once that case is exchanged hands, the buyer then takes that gold and sells it into the gold souk in Dubai. It gets sold as scrap gold to one of the 11 refineries in the Emirates. Once the souk is facilitating washing conflict gold or blood gold into the system. Doesn't matter how shiny or beautiful that bar of gold looks once it's been refined, you just cannot guarantee it's ethical. There is no chance at all.
To do business in the biggest two of the Emirates, Dubai and Abu Dhabi, it's good to be friends with at least one of the top three royals. Mohammed bin Zayed is the UAE's president, in charge of security and the military. Supporting him are his two brothers, Tahnoon and Mansour.
Mansour bin Zayed is in charge of finance and economy, and then you have Tahnoon bin Zayed. He's very much the brain behind it, who's doing the forecasting, who's doing scenario planning, who's thinking of different opportunities for how to position the UAE on the global stage to advance and maximize interest.
The names behind the plan for the Abu Dhabi Royal Gold Refinery are revealing. PGR, one of Africa's biggest gold producers. Perline Holdings, a company with links to Russia's allies. And Sheikh Tahnoon's Royal Group. Royal Group, chaired by Sheikh Tahnoon, is a conglomerate of companies in telecommunications, in property, in oil and gas, in shipping and ports, in tech and tourism. Royal Group's owner is a new breed of billionaire sheikh that loves making money from business and is expanding into Africa. And like so much in the corporate sector in the Emirates, Tahnoon's portfolio is opaque, even impenetrable.
These entities that are tied into the strategic office of Tahnoon have a range of different subsidiaries and shell companies. Some of these shell companies operate from within the UAE, other shell companies operate from third countries. And you create networks that make it almost impossible to really trace who's behind these companies. Tahnoon's name rarely, if ever, appears anywhere because these subsidiaries are then again owned by people who might or might not even work for his office. And this subsidiary again might be owned by a foreign national. It's almost like these Russian dolls. You open one up and there's another one. You open one up, there's another one. And that's exactly how this operates quite deliberately. It creates dissociation and it creates plausible deniability.
Plausible deniability isn't illegal, but it is useful. If, like the UAE, you don't like too much regulation or scrutiny, especially if you're expanding your commerce into African countries, which have weak controls.
When we're talking about the UAE and the ambitions of the UAE leadership, we will see them trying to expand their country in the influential player, not simply even in the region, but beyond. So we see certain strategy and certain interests implemented in terms of the development of economic and political contacts with the African continent, with the Asia, establishing of the certain Indian Ocean strategy, but at the same time trying to maintain contacts with Europe.
When it comes to the UAE's making inroads into the Horn of Africa, into the Sahel area and into Northern Africa, again, Tahnoon's office has been very, very influential in that. In first and foremost, building networks of influencers and particularly political networks of stakeholders on the ground in these different countries.
One way the UAE has moved into Africa is through its ports and logistics giant, DP World. It has a global reach with a policy of commercial expansion that some see as an extension of political influence.
So enterprises and commercial networks are the key way for the UAE to advance their interest. It comes with plausible deniability, it's very discreet, it's not illegal. You can get involved through a company in a third country and nobody would ask any questions. Dubai Port World, the greatest container management company in the world, has been used by the Emiratis to get access to critical national infrastructures all around the world, including in the West America, UK, Europe, but also in Africa and in Asia. So it looks like a multinational that is a commercial entity, but in the end of the day, it's state-owned. So it becomes a tool of state interest as well.
The UAE's advances into Africa coincide with those of one of its closest allies, Russia. Russia's interest in the continent is an old one, which Vladimir Putin has long been keen to revive.
Previously, it was mainly arms exports to the continent, and there was a real link between Moscow and countries like Mozambique, Angola, South Africa in the 80s during the Cold War. Then they've started exporting military hardware, and also a lot of wheat and agricultural produce goes back and forth between Africa and Russia.
And today, Africa offers a particularly attractive prize for Russia.
They've come across this gold opportunity in countries like Mali, Central African Republic and Sudan, where they have large reserves of gold.
Beset by the biggest sanctions regime in history, Russia is turning to gold, a potential lifeline for its economy.
A gold reserve can help countries provide security. It's a way of sanctions proofing the country's central bank or economy, providing them options outside of those foreign currencies as a way to use or move finances around the world.
If Russia wanted to use its gold reserve to sanctions-proof its economy, it had a practical demonstration from recent history.
Venezuela was sanctioned and essentially cut off from international financial markets. During that time, Venezuelan gold was flown allegedly by Russian planes to gold hubs around the world, including Uganda, the UAE, and Turkey.
In 2019, investigative journalists reported that a Belgian gold trading company, Goertz Gold, bought 30% of the Venezuelan central bank's international gold sales. One shipment, nearly 16 tons in December 2018, was shortly after US sanctions were announced.
That gold was sold for foreign exchange that was then taken back to Venezuela and could be spent on paying the army or whatever they needed the foreign exchange for.
So there's certainly a real potential for Russia to use the gold trade in order to evade Western sanctions. What we do know is that in the years before the war in Ukraine started again last February, the Kremlin started to amass a huge war chest of gold in its foreign reserves.
It realized from many years ago that there was a real importance to try and ward against these economic sanctions and create what was called Fortress Russia. Now about 20% of the central bank is gold, and that's around $140 billion.
One company has done very well from the African gold rush. PGR Gold Trading LLC, a company based in Dubai, is owned and run by one of the most high-profile players in the business, a Belgian tycoon and president of Goertz Gold, the same company that had purchased Venezuela's gold in 2019. And Alan Goertz is no stranger to controversy.
Goertz and his brother Sylvain were convicted in a Belgian court a couple of years ago of money laundering and fraud. According to the court judgment, as reported by Reuters, there was over $1 billion of cash transactions in a 2-year period.
Alan Goertz disputed the ruling and said his business practices were common and legal at the relevant time. Goertz and gold go back a long way, making him a perfect teammate if you want to get into the refining business. Not just that, he's an old Africa hand too.
Alan Goertz is a very, very prominent player in gold, operating in a few countries, especially in East and Central Africa.
However, Goertz's dealings in Africa led to him being sanctioned by the US Treasury in 2022.
He gained the most press coverage and notoriety of sorts for his involvement in the African gold refinery in Uganda, which was incorporated in 2014.
As a company, AGR is a proud producer and exporter of high-finished gold bars according to international accredited standards.
Alan Goertz has always asserted high ethical standards in his companies.
Compliance, transparency, integrity contribute our foundation as AGR.
But the US Treasury sanctions imposed on Gertz and the African gold refinery suggest otherwise.
It was alleged to be accepting high-risk gold, accepting particularly gold from the DRC, from regions like South Kivu, where it's the sort of textbook example of what most people call conflict gold.
The DRC's immensely long border means illegal gold smuggling is easy. Some leaves legitimately, but a lot of its gold is high risk.
Around $300 to $600 million worth of gold is smuggled out of Eastern Congo every year. And that represents over 90% of the supply chain, which is not benefiting the Congolese government, the Congolese people.
The Democratic Republic of Congo, or DRC, the second biggest country in Africa, has been mired in armed conflict for decades. Paramilitary groups control great swathes of it, and they're heavily funded by illegally mined and smuggled gold.
You see basically thugs with guns, people with AK-47s and uniforms of various kinds, either the various units of the Congolese army or rebel groups.
Over 90% of DRC gold is smuggled to other African countries. From there, elsewhere, including the UAE, some of it to be anonymized and sold to the world. The United Nations decided to act. It drafted a proposal to sanction Gertz, but hit a problem.
And it's a shame that Russia vetoed the UN sanctions or threatened to veto, so it never actually came to a vote.
Faced with this obstruction at the UN, the US government acted promptly. Gertz said the US sanctions were based on misinformation and claimed he had not been to the DRC for 20 years. The African gold rush is making the UAE's entrepreneurs very rich, and it has also benefited Russian companies that have set up operations there. And nowhere has Russia's gold mining been more successful than in Sudan, where in 2017 Vladimir Putin found a friend in the dictator Omar al-Bashir.
It began in 2017 when they had a conference in Russia in Sochi. Bashir and Vladimir Putin then came closer together, and he offered him some mining concessions in Sudan, and also the possibility to build a naval base on the Red Sea.
Bashir needed Russian military expertise to prop up his regime. And Putin could see a customer for Russian arms and the means to pay in its potentially huge goldfields.
And some people say it has the most gold in the whole of Africa. The two other large markets with gold are South Africa and Ghana. But because there's been a lack of a real study done in Sudan to see how much gold there is, it could possibly have more.
An early deal with Bashir involved mining rights for Russian companies. Putin needed a reliable middleman with a unique mix of skills in both statecraft and business. He turned to an old ally, Yevgeny Prigozhin.
He's a very unusual Russian oligarch. First, he sort of surfaced on the international radar through something known as the Internet Research Agency. That's this organization that was accused of trying to meddle in the 2016 presidential election in the United States.
Prigozhin and the Kremlin have denied this charge of the FBI and the US Department of State. Putin, in 2018, asked Prigozhin to lead Russia's political and commercial expansion into Africa. He set up a mining company, M-Invest, in Khartoum. But it was soon advising Bashir how to discredit his enemies.
Prigozhin-related companies have provided political services, disinformation services for the Sudanese government. Russian advisors started to tell President Bashir how he should try to push back this wave of popular protests that were threatening to topple his regime. At the same time, a major disinformation campaign started on social media in Sudan, based in Russia. And of course, the Russians also began to provide military training to the Sudanese military, and military equipment started coming into the country.
Sudan became the first Arab nation to purchase Russia's fourth-generation Su-24 fighter jets as part of a deal for equipment upgrades and training worth an estimated $1 billion. But another of Prigozhin's projects of proven service to Putin would now prove decisive for President Bashir.
Wagner Group, or Wagner PMC, private military corporation, is essentially a Russian private military outfit that provides combat services in a variety of theaters around the world.
Prigozhin's private army of mercenaries could be relied on to do whatever was needed by the president or his friends. No questions asked, and of course, their activities would never be traced back to the Kremlin.
We saw them apply this for the first time in 2014 when the Russian military started to support separatist groups in eastern Ukraine. It was very useful for them to have that plausible deniability in an operation like that, where at the time Russia didn't officially actually take part in hostilities against Ukraine. We saw them used in the conflict in Syria, where they backed up the Russian military power. Wagner offered that capability to take losses, to get involved in the heavy fighting without having to risk the direct assets of the Russian state.
As Bashir's grip on power weakened, Wagner Group units started to appear in Sudan with somewhat unorthodox contracts.
It's understood that rather than Sudan paying the Wagner Group for services, Sudan provided natural mining rights to the companies associated with Wagner. And that is how the people behind Wagner, Prigozhin and other business people there, are actually retrieving their profits from the operation.
As Russian mining companies started to produce more and more of the precious metal, they hit a problem. The gold on its own was useless. It needed to be sold for hard currency. And that meant getting it out of the country, preferably without paying any tax. Russian mining companies linked to Prigozhin were able to enlist the help of one of Bashir's generals, a veteran of Sudan's horrific Darfur War, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo Hemeti. He was something of an expert on smuggling gold out of Sudan.
Hemeti was gifted a large mine in Darfur called Jebel Amma as thanks from Bashir, saying thank you for helping me fighting in the Darfur War. And that's when Hemeti really became involved in gold mining in Sudan. And this is a huge gold mine. Some say it was pumping out $500 million a year. So this relatively obscure lieutenant, as it were, of Bashir suddenly had a huge gold mine in Darfur.
With his gold fortune secured, Hemeti built up a private army called the Rapid Support Force. Russia reportedly offered Hemeti training from Wagner Group, as well as arms. In return, Hemeti helped Russia transport gold out of the country.
It's unclear how much of that gold is actually lifted out of Sudan back to Moscow in the form of gold versus financial profits that are then feeding back into Moscow. A lot of the gold that is being mined in Sudan by Russian companies or others is being taken out of the country, exported to, for example, the United Arab Emirates, some of it officially, some of it illegally. And this, of course, is generating massive amounts of revenue that are then being divided between the different actors involved. Wagner Group on the one hand, other Russian interests involved in that effort, and Hemeti and his family on the other side.
A source that I spoke to said security is very poor. He estimated there are around 40 airstrips across the whole of Sudan, and with which small carrier planes would pick up gold from these mining areas and fly them back to Russia or to Dubai.
Although some gold is transported out of Sudan legally, the scale of smuggling is a huge problem. A third of Sudan's population needs humanitarian aid just to survive. Tax from gold exports could change that. But smuggling keeps the country poor. A glance at the books from the government's mining company, the SMRC, and the National Bank quickly reveals the scale of Sudan's missing money.
لو حسبنا السنوات الأخيرة اللي صدرت عنها التقارير الرسمية من الشركة السودانية، سواء على مستوى الشركة السودانية للموارد المعدنية أو على مستوى بنك السودان، تجد التقرير يتحدث عن إنتاج الذهب ويتحدث عن صادر الذهب، ويكون هنالك فارق كبير بين الإنتاج الفعلي والصادر. فما هو هذا الفارق؟ هذا بشكل مؤكد يعني فقد يذهب للتهريب، جزء منه للتهريب. عندما تجد على مستوى تقارير بنك السودان، مفترض إنه كل بين قوسين الذهب اللي ينتج فيه السودان يأتي إلى مصفاة الخرطوم للذهب بإشراف بنك السودان. الشركة السودانية هي الذراع الفني لوزارة المعادن السودانية. في واحدة من السنوات تتحدث عن إنتاج 70 طن من الذهب، في حين إنه بنك السودان يتحدث عن استلام 50 طن من الذهب. ده فارق ونسبة كبيرة تدل على مؤشرات يعني مؤشرات فيها مخالفات كبيرة.
But it's not just smuggling that's costing Sudan. It's that Russian mining companies don't pay what their contracts stipulate. Meanwhile, other Russian companies are teaming up to set up operations in Sudan. One of them, Kush E&P, has benefited from these arrangements.
كانت عندها ديون دي كانت قديمة موجودة لم يكن يسأل عنها في عهد النظام السابق. عندما جاءت الحكومة المدنية الأخيرة ضغطت عليهم، فبالتالي كان لابد أن يبحثوا عن شريك سياسي قوي لديه نفوذ في السودان، لديه علاقات واسعة مع الحكام الجدد في السودان لا سيما المكون العسكري، وبالتالي تتم حماية هذه المصالح الروسية الإماراتية بالشكل المشترك لهذه الشراكات، والتي يعني في تقارير كثيرة تتحدث عن أنها ستتوسع سواء داخل السودان أو في دول أخرى حول السودان.
Enter Russian magnate Boris Ivanov, former boss of oil and gas giant Gazprom and now of GBP Global Resources. In a joint venture with Emirati investors, he formed the Dubai-based mining company Emerald Resources. And Emerald came to the rescue of debt-laden Kush.
شركة كوش في بداية العام 2020 وقعت هذا العقد مع الشركة الإماراتية في وجود ممثلين لشركة إمرال ووجود وزير المعادن السوداني ووزيرة المالية، ودفعت الشركة الإماراتية جزء بعد إجراء تسوية.
It's a long-term investment. It takes a lot of time to bring it to fruition and to make a profit.
Boris Ivanov and his Emirati friends at Emerald paid 11 million euros to Sudan, and Kush was back in business. With Kush and Emerald now working together, Sudan's gold rush is accelerating even faster and bringing ever greater windfalls for the Russians and their Emirati friends.
Gold, I believe, will remain to be the most important element of financial stability.
Disputes between companies and host governments are a widespread occurrence in Africa, and Sudan is no different. There's no evidence that Kush and Emerald are not paying duty on exported gold, but Sudan's gold smuggling is a major problem, and it is one that is in a league of its own.
إذا لم يكن هناك من يحرك لروسيا، لا يمكن لروسيا أن تأتي وأن تأخذ مقدرات الشعب السوداني. نعم هم باعترافهم، يعني حتى يعني وزارة المعادن تقول بأنه إحنا صدرنا حتى الآن ما يقارب 36 طن، بينما الإنتاج 100 طن. فهذه معادلة لا تحتاج إلى كثير لغط، يعني هذه معادلة معروفة أن هناك عندنا كم 60 طن فاقد. هي ليست فاقد، هي منتجة وأنتجت، ولكنها ذهبت عبر التهريب ولم تصب في مصلحة الاقتصاد السوداني، ولم تصب عبر القنوات الرسمية التي يمكن أن يستفيد منها المواطن السوداني.
This is a major loss for African governments because they're not making revenues on that gold in the form of export royalties or taxes.
But there's a far darker side to the African gold rush. And it has taken a dramatic turn since the invasion of Ukraine. Many of the miners in Sudan are small-scale artisan operators, extracting ore by hand. Facing harassment from local paramilitary groups, Adam Zakaria and a group of other Sudanese miners crossed the border to mine the gold-rich hills of Kandahar province in the Central African Republic. It wasn't long before they were being harassed again.
الهجوم بدأ 13 مارس. جو الروسيين داخلين الناحية الجنوبية. مجرد ما دخلوا بدوا سلب وبدوا النهب، بدوا ضرب.
The horrific attack on Adam and the other miners in Kandahar that day was not a one-off.
وتم الهجوم عليهم من قبل قوات روسية. هم تحدثوا وصف هذه القوات بأنها هي قوات هم يؤكدوا أنها قوات تابعة لمجموعة فاغنر. هدفها الأساسي هو إخلاء هذه المنطقة من المعدنين لكي تدين لهذه القوات الروسية. تحدثوا عن عمليات كانت بشعة في طريقة القتل وفي استخدام الأسلحة. كانت هناك أسلحة ثقيلة والهليكوبترات والدبابات وعربات دفع رباعي وحتى دراجات نارية تم استخدامها. تم ذبح لبعض المعدنين وتم قتل بطريقة الدفن الجماعي لبعض الآخرين. كانت عملية عسكرية كبيرة وتم تعقب هؤلاء المعدنين عن طريق الأقمار الصناعية إلى مناطق بعيدة حتى الحدود التشادية والحدود السودانية.
طريقة الضرب ذاته مجموعة يلموكم مجموعة 5 6 7 شخص يضربوكم سويا.
Another eyewitness to the killings is Saddam Abakar. In a deliberate affront to Muslim values, the Russian attackers ensured their victims could not receive a decent burial.
يوم الأحد يوم 13 الساعة 3:30 ضربوا ال8 نفر ديل كلهم. ال4 ديل أخواني أنا لزم، وبعد ما ضربوهم قمزوا فيهم الخنابل، كل الخنابل. يعني ناس أبرياء، ناس يعني تجار وماشيين لمكان عملهم.
Back in Sudan, the families of relatives killed have paid a heavy price for the mining on gold fields claimed by Wagner Group.
ولدي عمره 31 سنة، اشتغل لقى مال، عنده مواطن 2 دين مليونات قروش ومليونات ذهب، والله أموال كثيرة وكلها أشياء بقت ما فيها، تليفونات وحاجات دي كلها ما جاتنا أي حاجة. ما في زول هنو زي ولدي أنا. ما فقط على الأسرة دي كلها واقف، ما بيقصر من أي زول.
هذا الأمر طبعا هو أمر ممكن أن نقول عنه أنه هو متكرر في أفريقيا، ويحدث صراع حول الموارد، وتأتي قوى أجنبية من أجل السيطرة على الموارد. هذا الأمر تم في السابق من قبل قوى غربية والآن يتم من قبل الروس وشركاتهم.
A few days after the atrocities in the Central African Republic, another outrage took place in West Africa at the hands of Wagner Group.
Hey!
According to eyewitnesses, 350 men were killed over 4 days.
These two cases, one in Central African Republic and one in Mali, it seems to me like the Wagner Group has now been unleashed in Africa, whereas before it seemed to be slightly restrained in its operations and was doing things covertly like misinformation during the uprisings in Sudan. So this is a worrying trend, and which has only happened since the Ukraine war, that I think we should all be concerned about.
Like Sudan, much of Mali's gold is mined by hand. This method offers an estimated 8 million people in Africa a way out of poverty. With just hand tools, these artisan mines are extremely arduous and perilous. And now, in Africa's gold rush, the men have been replaced by trafficked children.
You're seeing something unfold under your eyes that actually probably most of the world don't know about.
Paddy Dowling was shocked by what he discovered.
The mines themselves are, as far as the eye can see, at 180 degrees, this kind of sprawling vista of activity. People panning for gold, people walking around with gold detectors to see what concentration of gold is in that earth that's been brought up or excavated. Women working with children wrapped up in kind of swaddling to them. You may get young girls that are panning, and then you've got children that are just wandering around the mining sites. So the dangers are very, very high. There's holes being dug absolutely everywhere, vertical shafts that go down about 16 to 20 meters. The boys will do the digging predominantly, and the way it normally works is you have a team of 2 or 3 people. Usually the smallest member of that team will start that hole. If a 13-year-old child is digging, the width of that hole is probably no wider than his shoulders. Once they hit the bottom of their shaft and they start digging out, they take it in turns to bring the earth back up, or the gold-bearing soils back up, to see what they found.
In the wet season, the mines are prone to collapse, and miners traditionally avoid them. But the children of Africa's gold rush don't have that luxury.
The dangers involved in mining during the rainy season are extremely grave because the shafts down are not supported and the shafts along that radiate underneath are not supported. So when the soil is extremely wet, that's when you have collapse and cave-in. To actually understand how awful the conditions were, I actually free climbed down a 20-meter shaft. Then you have to, in the dark, find the little tiny grooves and indentations where you put your feet. And then you get to the bottom, and it is hot and it is airless. I was down there for half an hour and I was absolutely drenched and totally exhausted. Children are taken against their will often. They are trafficked from Burkina Faso or other neighbouring countries, and a debt bondage is enforced, $1,000, something like that. And they cannot leave until that debt is paid, which means working through the rainy season, which means putting their life at enormous danger. These children are sleeping maybe 10 to a room. They're sometimes going days without food. They're working in the toiling kind of heat and sun. That is not modern-day slavery, that's almost imprisonment.
Trafficking children to work in mines that are death traps is just one consequence of a deeply flawed gold supply chain. The buyers of gold in the Middle East don't traffic children, but their insatiable demand drives it nonetheless.
When I started peeling off a few layers of what this was really about and who was being affected and who was behind it, I could not escape the fact that every single person mentioned the United Arab Emirates. And I said, surely there must be somebody else involved, somebody else that's running this, and they all replied no. The UAE want every grain and every gram of gold that we have.
The draft plan for the Abu Dhabi Royal Gold Refinery shows a link between UAE royalty, a subsequently sanctioned individual, and a Belarusian businessman. There are indications that Russia's allies and the UAE are increasingly collaborating in the gold industry. One of the companies on the MOU was Perline Holdings. Its managing director is named as Belarusian businessman Alexander Zingman. Well known as friend to Belarus president and Putin ally, Alexander Lukashenko. And Zingman's connections with senior African politicians, especially in the Democratic Republic of Congo, make him the perfect middleman if you're determined to cash in on an African gold rush. Zingman hit the headlines in 2021 when, accused of arms dealing, he was arrested in the DRC with Perline general manager Paulo Pacico and held for 12 days.
No evidence was presented. We don't know why he's there. We put there by force, so we don't understand what's going on.
After the allegations against Zingman and Pacico were found to be false and dropped, the Belarusian could resume his business interests, this time with Abu Dhabi royalty. This agreement of February 2020 is for another Abu Dhabi gold refinery. The deal was never realized, but it's between Zingman and Hamad Al-Shamsi, manager of Sheikh Tahnoon's mother's office and formerly his PR manager. Sheikh Tahnoon's Royal Group and Al-Shamsi's Wadi Industrial Investment have the same company address. The planned refineries, which were never built, were always intended to be legal and compliant. But inevitably, the gold they would have handled financed conflict and was often smuggled.
There are significant policy and enforcement loopholes that facilitate this dirty trade. Those loopholes really need to be closed. There's very minimal documentation that customs requires when you import the gold because they're not taxing it. That's a significant issue.
And the criminality in the African gold rush is accelerating as the supply increases to meet demand.
The aggressive nature in which the Emirates are buying gold has put so much pressure. The pressure is trickling down right to those children at the bottom of the mine. And there is no let up in production. There is no let up in anything. Some of those children, they may go a month where they hadn't hit their targets and they would get nothing at all. Dubai is not doing anything illegal. It is immoral, in my opinion, knowing that at the end of that chain of buying gold, someone is paying the highest price. That is completely wrong. I actually reached out to the Dubai Multi-Commodity Centre and asked them for comments from the Ministry of Economics on, and there were some pretty straightforward questions. How do you feel as a country knowing that children are being trafficked from Burkina Faso at the ages of 13 or 14, having to work in these conditions, for living under the extreme poverty levels? How do you feel about that? And they were quite basic questions that I think any human being could ask any human being. And I gave Ministry of Economics around about a month to come back, and they never bothered.
The UAE's statecraft, as well as the brand of the UAE, is kind of open for everyone, attracting any sort of money, networks, influence, and investments from all over the world. They don't differentiate between a dictator or a democrat. They don't differentiate between a warlord or a legitimate security company. They don't differentiate between mercenaries and war criminals. All of them are welcome.
The UAE's unregulated business environment means that there is insufficient scrutiny of some of those operating in the African gold rush, leading to the potential for negative and sinister consequences worldwide.
When we talk about, for instance, Russia taking lots of gold from Africa, we may actually be looking at the emergence of a sort of sanctions economy in which states that have common cause may use the gold that they are securing, mostly from the global south, to create their own alternative financial system.
And in the jewelry markets of the world, from the gold souks to the high street, consumer choice could well be the only way of cleaning up the African gold rush.
What goes on to make these products? What goes on to make that beautiful necklace or that amazing watch? Until actually consumers ourselves say, I want total assurances that what I'm buying is ethical. But until that happens, I just can't see anything changing.